On Genius. Essay by Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer. No difference of rank, position, or birth is so great as the gulf that separates the countless millions who use their head only in the service of their belly, in other words, look upon it as an instrument of the will, and those very few and rare persons who have the courage to say, "No. It is too good for that. My head shall be active only in its own service. It shall try to comprehend the wondrous and varied spectacle of this world, and then reproduce it in some form, whether as art or as literature, that may answer to my character as an individual. These are the truly noble, the real noblesse of the world. The others are serfs and go with the soil, glebe et scripti." Of course, I am here referring to those who have not only the courage, but also the call, and therefore the right, to order the head to quit the service of the will, with a result that proves the sacrifice to have been worth the making. In the case of those to whom all this can only partially apply, the gulf is not so wide, but even though their talent be small, so long as it is real, there will always be a sharp line of demarcation between them and the millions. The works of fine art, poetry, and philosophy produced by a nation are the outcome of the superfluous intellect existing in it. For him who can understand aright, cum grano salis, with a grain of salt, the relation between the genius and the normal man may perhaps be best expressed as follows. A genius has a double intellect, one for himself and the service of his will, the other for the world, of which he becomes the mirror, in virtue of his purely objective attitude towards it. The work of art or poetry or philosophy produced by the genius is simply the result, or quintessence, of this contemplative attitude, elaborated according to certain technical rules. The normal man, on the other hand, has only a single intellect, which may be called subjective by contrast with the objective intellect of genius. However acute this subjective intellect may be, and it exists in very various degrees of perfection, it is never on the same level with the double intellect of genius, just as the open-chest notes of the human voice, however high, are essentially different from the falsetto notes. These, like the two upper octaves of the flute and the harmonics of the violin, are produced by the column of air dividing itself into two vibrating halves, with a node between them, while the open-chest notes of the human voice and the lower octave of the flute are produced by the undivided column of air vibrating as a whole. This illustration may help the reader to understand that specific peculiarity of genius which is unmistakably stamped on the works, and even on the physiognomy, of him who is gifted with it. At the same time, it is obvious that a double intellect like this must, as a rule, obstruct the service of the will, and this explains the poor capacity often shown by genius in the conduct of life. And what specially characterizes genius is that it has none of that sobriety of temper which is always to be found in the ordinary simple intellect, be it acute or dull. The brain may be likened to a parasite which is nourished as a part of the human frame without contributing directly to its inner economy. It is securely housed in the topmost story, and there leads a self-sufficient and independent life. In the same way, it may be said that a man endowed with great mental gifts leads, apart from the individual life common to all, a second life, purely of the intellect. He devotes himself to the constant increase, rectification, and extension, not of mere learning but of real systematic knowledge and insight, and remains untouched by the fate that overtakes him personally, so long as it does not disturb him in his work. It is thus a life which raises a man and sets him above fate and its changes. Always thinking, learning, experimenting, practicing his knowledge, the man soon comes to look upon this second life as the chief mode of existence, and his merely personal life as something subordinate, serving only to advance ends higher than itself. An example of this independent, separate existence is furnished by Goethe. During the war in the Champagne, and amid all the bustle of the camp, he made observations for his theory of color, and as soon as the numberless calamities of that war allowed of his retiring for a short time to the fortress of Luxembourg, he took up the manuscript of his Farbenlehre. This is an example which we, the salt of the earth, should endeavor to follow by never letting anything disturb us in the pursuit of our intellectual life, however much the storm of the world may invade and agitate our personal environment, always remembering that we are the sons, not of the bondwoman but of the free. As our emblem and coat of arms, I propose a tree mightily shaken by the wind, but still bearing its ruddy fruit on every branch, with the motto Dum conveller mitscunt, while I am shaken they grow gentle, or conquasita sed ferax, shattered but fruitful. That purely intellectual life of the individual has its counterpart in humanity as a whole. For there, too, the real life is the life of the will, both in the empirical and in the transcendental meaning of the word. The purely intellectual life of humanity lies in its effort to increase knowledge by means of the sciences, and its desire to perfect the arts. Both science and art thus advance slowly from one generation to another, and grow with the centuries, every race as it hurries by furnishing its contribution. This intellectual life, like some gift from heaven, hovers over the stir and movement of the world, or it is, as it were, a sweet-scented air developed out of the ferment itself, the real life of mankind dominated by will, and side by side with the history of nations, the history of philosophy, science and art takes its innocent and bloodless way. The difference between the genius and the ordinary man is, no doubt, a quantitative one, insofar as it is a difference of degree, but I am tempted to regard it also as qualitative, in view of the fact that ordinary minds, notwithstanding individual variation, have a certain tendency to think alike. Thus on similar occasions their thoughts at once all take a similar direction and run on the same lines, and this explains why their judgments constantly agree, not however because they are based on truth. To such lengths does this go that certain fundamental views obtain amongst mankind at all times, and are always being repeated and brought forward anew, whilst the great minds of all ages are in open or secret opposition to them. A genius is a man in whose mind the world is presented as an object is presented in a mirror, but with a degree more of clearness and a greater distinction of outline than is attained by ordinary people. It is from him that humanity may look for most instruction, for the deepest insight into the most important matters is to be acquired, not by an observant attention to detail, but by a close study of things as a whole. And if his mind reaches maturity, the instruction he gives will be conveyed now in one form, now in another. Thus genius may be defined as an eminently clear consciousness of things in general, and therefore, also of that which is opposed to them, namely one's own self. The world looks up to a man thus endowed, and expects to learn something about life and its real nature. But several highly favorable circumstances must combine to produce genius, and this is a very rare event. It happens only now and then, let us say once in a century, that a man is born whose intellect so perceptibly surpasses the normal measure as to amount to that second faculty which seems to be accidental, as it is out of all relation to the will. He may remain a long time without being recognized or appreciated, stupidity preventing the one and envy the other. But should this once come to pass, mankind will crowd round him and his works, in the hope that he may be able to enlighten some of the darkness of their existence or inform them about it. His message is, to some extent, a revelation, and he himself a higher being, even though he may be but little above the ordinary standard. Like the ordinary man, the genius is what he is chiefly for himself. This is essential to his nature, a fact which can neither be avoided nor altered. He may be for others remains a matter of chance and of secondary importance. In no case can people receive from his mind more than a reflection, and then only when he joins with them in the attempt to get his thought into their heads, where, however, it is never anything but an exotic plant, stunted and frail. In order to have original, uncommon, and perhaps even immortal thoughts, it is enough to estrange oneself so fully from the world of things for a few moments, that the most ordinary objects and events appear quite new and unfamiliar. In this way their true nature is disclosed. What is here demanded cannot, perhaps, be said to be difficult. It is not in our power at all, but is just the province of genius. By itself, genius can produce original thoughts just as little as a woman by herself can bear children. Outward circumstances must come to fructify genius, and be, as it were, a father to its progeny. The mind of genius is among other minds what the carbuncle is among precious stones. It sends forth light of its own, while the others reflect only that which they have received. The relation of the genius to the ordinary mind may also be described as that of an idioelectrical body to one which merely is a conductor of electricity. The mere man of learning who spends his life in teaching what he has learned, is not strictly to be called a man of genius, just as idioelectrical bodies are not conductors. Nay, genius stands to mere learning as the words to the music in a song. A man of learning is a man who has learned a great deal. A man of genius, one from whom we learn something which the genius has learned from nobody. Great minds, of which there is scarcely one in 100 millions, are thus the lighthouses of humanity, and without them mankind would lose itself in the boundless sea of monstrous error and bewilderment. And so the simple man of learning in the strict sense of the word, the ordinary professor for instance, looks upon the genius much as we look upon a hare, which is good to eat after it has been killed and dressed up. So long as it is alive, it is only good to shoot at. He who wishes to experience gratitude from his contemporaries, must adjust his pace to theirs. But great things are never produced in this way. And he who wants to do great things must direct his gaze to posterity, and in firm confidence elaborate his work for coming generations. No doubt, the result may be that he will remain quite unknown to his contemporaries, and comparable to a man who, compelled to spend his life upon a lonely island, with great effort sets up a monument there, to transmit to future seafarers the knowledge of his existence. If he thinks it a hard fate, let him console himself with the reflection that the ordinary man who lives for practical aims only, often suffers a like fate, without having any compensation to hope for, inasmuch as he may, under favorable conditions, spend a life of material production, earning, buying, building, fertilizing, laying out, founding, establishing, beautifying with daily effort and unflagging zeal, and all the time think that he is working for himself, and yet in the end it is his descendants who reap the benefit of it all, and sometimes not even his descendants. It is the same with the man of genius. He too hopes for his reward and for honor at least, and at last finds that he has worked for posterity alone. Both, to be sure, have inherited a great deal from their ancestors. The compensation I have mentioned as the privilege of genius lies, not in what it is to others, but in what it is to itself. What man has in any real sense lived more than he whose moments of thought make their echoes heard through the tumult of centuries? Perhaps, after all, it would be the best thing for a genius to attain undisturbed possession of himself, by spending his life in enjoying the pleasure of his own thoughts, his own works, and by admitting the world only as the heir of his ample existence. Then the world would find the mark of his existence only after his death, as it finds that of the ichneolith. It is not only in the activity of his highest powers that the genius surpasses ordinary people. A man who is unusually well-knit, supple and agile, will perform all his movements with exceptional ease, even with comfort, because he takes a direct pleasure in an activity for which he is particularly well equipped, and therefore often exercises it without any object. Further, if he is an acrobat or a dancer, not only does he take leaps which other people cannot execute, but he also betrays rare elasticity and agility in those easier steps which others can also perform, and even in ordinary walking. In the same way, a man of superior mind will not only produce thoughts and works which could never have come from another. It will not be here alone that he will show his greatness, but as knowledge and thought form a mode of activity natural and easy to him, he will also delight himself in them at all times, and so apprehend small matters which are within the range of other minds, more easily, quickly and correctly than they. Thus he will take a direct and lively pleasure in every increase of knowledge, every problem solved, every witty thought, whether of his own or another's, and so his mind will have no further aim than to be constantly active. This will be an inexhaustible spring of delight, and boredom, that spectre which haunts the ordinary man, can never come near him. Then too, the masterpieces of past and contemporary men of genius exist in their fullness for him alone. If a great product of genius is recommended to the ordinary, simple mind, it will take as much pleasure in it as the victim of gout receives in being invited to a ball. The one goes for the sake of formality, and the other reads the book so as not to be in arrear. For La Bruyère was quite right when he said, "All the wit in the world is lost upon him who has none." The whole range of thought of a man of talent, or of a genius, compared with the thoughts of the common man, is, even when directed to objects essentially the same, like a brilliant oil painting, full of life, compared with a mere outline or a weak sketch in watercolor. All this is part of the reward of genius, and compensates him for a lonely existence in a world with which he has nothing in common and no sympathies. But since size is relative, it comes to the same thing whether I say Caius was a great man, or Caius has to live amongst wretchedly small people, for Brobdingnac and Lilliput vary only in the point from which they start. However great, then, however admirable or instructive, a long posterity may think the author of immortal works, during his lifetime he will appear to his contemporaries small, wretched, and insipid in proportion. This is what I mean by saying that as there are 300 degrees from the base of a tower to the summit, so there are exactly 300 from the summit to the base. Great minds thus owe little ones some indulgence, for it is only in virtue of these little minds that they themselves are great. Let us, then, not be surprised if we find men of genius generally unsociable and repellent. It is not their want of sociability that is to blame. Their path through the world is like that of a man who goes for a walk on a bright summer morning. He gazes with delight on the beauty and freshness of nature, but he has to rely wholly on that for entertainment, for he can find no society but the peasants as they bend over the earth and cultivate the soil. It is often the case that a great mind prefers soliloquy to the dialogue he may have in this world. If he condescends to it now and then, the hollowness of it may possibly drive him back to his soliloquy, for in forgetfulness of his interlocutor, or caring little whether he understands or not, he talks to him as a child talks to a doll. Modesty in a great mind would no doubt be pleasing to the world, but unluckily, it is a contradictio in ejecto. It would compel a genius to give the thoughts and opinions, nay, even the method and style, of the million preference over his own, to set a higher value upon them, and wide apart as they are, to bring his views into harmony with theirs, or even suppress them altogether so as to let the others hold the field. In that case, however, he would either produce nothing at all, or else his achievements would be just upon a level with theirs. Great, genuine and extraordinary work can be done only in so far as its author disregards the method, the thoughts, the opinions of his contemporaries, and quietly works on, in spite of their criticism, on his side despising what they praise. No one becomes great without arrogance of this sort. Should his life and work fall upon a time which cannot recognize and appreciate him, he is at any rate true to himself, like some noble traveler forced to pass the night in a miserable inn. When morning comes, he contentedly goes his way. A poet or philosopher should have no fault to find with his age if it only permits him to do his work undisturbed in his own corner, nor with his fate if the corner granted him allows of his following his vocation without having to think about other people. For the brain to be a mere laborer in the service of the belly, is indeed the common lot of almost all those who do not live on the work of their hands, and they are far from being discontented with their lot. But it strikes despair into a man of great mind, whose brain power goes beyond the measure necessary for the service of the will, and he prefers, if need be, to live in the narrowest circumstances, so long as they afford him the free use of his time for the development and application of his faculties. In other words, if they give him the leisure which is invaluable to him. It is otherwise with ordinary people. For them leisure has no value in itself, nor is it, indeed, without its dangers, as these people seem to know. The technical work of our time, which is done to an unprecedented perfection, has, by increasing and multiplying objects of luxury, given the favorites of fortune a choice between more leisure and culture upon the one side, and additional luxury and good living, but with increased activity upon the other, and true to their character they choose the latter and prefer champagne to freedom. And they are consistent in their choice, for to them, every exertion of the mind which does not serve the aims of the will is folly. Intellectual effort for its own sake they call eccentricity. Therefore, persistence in the aims of the will and the belly will be concentricity, and, to be sure, the will is the center, the kernel of the world. But in general it is very seldom that any such alternative is presented. For as with money, most men have no superfluity, but only just enough for their needs, so with intelligence. They possess just what will suffice for the service of the will, that is, for the carrying on of their business. Having made their fortune, they are content to gape or to indulge in sensual pleasures or childish amusements, cards or dice, or they will talk in the dullest way, or dress up and make obeisance to one another. And how few are those who have even a little superfluity of intellectual power. Like the others they too make themselves a pleasure, but it is a pleasure of the intellect. Either they will pursue some liberal study which brings them in nothing, or they will practice some art, and in general they will be capable of taking an objective interest in things, so that it will be possible to converse with them. But with the others it is better not to enter into any relations at all, for except when they tell the results of their own experience or give an account of their special vocation, or at any rate impart what they have learned from someone else, their conversation will not be worth listening to, and if anything is said to them, they will rarely grasp or understand it aright, and it will in most cases be opposed to their own opinions. Balthazar Gracian describes them very strikingly as men who are not men, hombres que non lo son. And Giordano Bruno says the same thing. What a difference there is in having to do with men compared with those who are only made in their image and likeness, and how wonderfully this passage agrees with that remark in the Chorale. The common people look like men, but I have never seen anything quite like them. If the reader will consider the extent to which these ideas agree in thought and even in expression, and in the wide difference between them in point of date and nationality, he cannot doubt but that they are at one with the facts of life. It was certainly not under the influence of those passages that, about 20 years ago, I tried to get a snuff-box made, the lid of which should have 2 fine chestnuts represented upon it, if possible in mosaic, together with a leaf which was to show that they were horse-chestnuts. This symbol was meant to keep the thought constantly before my mind. If anyone wishes for entertainment such as will prevent him feeling solitary even when he is alone, let me recommend the company of dogs, whose moral and intellectual qualities may almost afford delight and gratification. Still, we should always be careful to avoid being unjust. I am often surprised by the cleverness and now and again by the stupidity of my dog, and I have similar experiences with mankind. Countless times, in indignation at their incapacity, their total lack of discernment, their bestiality, I have been forced to echo the old complaint that folly is the mother and the nurse of the human race. Humani generis mater nutrix perfecto. Stultitia est. Indeed, folly is the mother and nurse of the human race. But at other times I have been astounded that from such a race there could have gone forth so many arts and sciences, abounding in so much use and beauty, even though it has always been the few that produce them. Yet these arts and sciences have struck root, established and perfected themselves, and the race has with persistent fidelity preserved Homer, Plato, Horace and others for thousands of years, by copying and treasuring their writings, thus saving them from oblivion, in spite of all the evils and atrocities that have happened in the world. Thus the race has proved that it appreciates the value of these things, and at the same time it can form a correct view of special achievements or estimate signs of judgment and intelligence. When this takes place amongst those who belong to the great multitude, it is by a kind of inspiration. Sometimes a correct opinion will be formed by the multitude itself, but this is only when the chorus of praise has grown full and complete. It is then like the sound of untrained voices, where there are enough of them, it is always harmonious. Those who emerge from the multitude, those who are called men of genius, are merely the lucida intervalla of the whole human race. They achieve that which others could not possibly achieve. Their originality is so great that not only is their divergence from others obvious, but their individuality is expressed with such force, that all the men of genius who have ever existed show, every one of them, peculiarities of character and mind, so that the gift of his works is one which he alone of all men could ever have presented to the world. This is what makes that simile of Ariosto so true and so justly celebrated. Natura lo fis e poi rup lo stampo. After nature stamps a man of genius, she breaks the die. But there is always a limit to human capacity, and no one can be a great genius without having some decidedly weak side, it may even be some intellectual narrowness. In other words, there will foe some faculty in which he is now and then inferior to men of moderate endowments. It will be a faculty which, if strong, might have been an obstacle to the exercise of the qualities in which he excels. What this weak point is, it will always be hard to define with any accuracy even in a given case. It may be better expressed indirectly. Thus Plato's weak point is exactly that in which Aristotle is strong and vice versa, and so too Kant is deficient just where Goethe is great. Now, mankind is fond of venerating something, but its veneration is generally directed to the wrong object, and it remains so directed until posterity comes to set it right. But the educated public is no sooner set right in this, than the honor which is due to genius degenerates, just as the honor which the faithful pay to their saints easily passes into a frivolous worship of relics. Thousands of Christians adore the relics of a saint whose life and doctrine are unknown to them, and the religion of thousands of Buddhists lies more in veneration of the holy tooth or some such object, or the vessel that contains it, or the holy bowl, or the fossil footstep, or the holy tree which Buddha planted, than in the thorough knowledge and faithful practice of his high teaching. Petrarch's house in Arqua, Tasso's supposed prison in Ferrara, Shakespeare's house in Stratford with his chair, Goethe's house in Weimar with its furniture, Kant's old hat, the autographs of great men, these things are gaped at with interest and awe by many who have never read their works. They cannot do anything more than just gape. The intelligent amongst them are moved by the wish to see the objects which the great man habitually had before his eyes, and by a strange illusion, these produce the mistaken notion that with the objects they are bringing back the man himself, or that something of him must cling to them. Akin to such people are those who earnestly strive to acquaint themselves with the subject matter of a poet's works, or to unravel the personal circumstances and events in his life which have suggested particular passages. This is as though the audience in a theater were to admire a fine scene and then rush upon the stage to look at the scaffolding that supports it. There are in our day enough instances of these critical investigators, and they prove the truth of the saying that mankind is interested, not in the form of a work, that is, in its manner of treatment, but in its actual matter. All it cares for is the theme. To read a philosopher's biography instead of studying his thoughts, is like neglecting a picture and attending only to the style of its frame, debating whether it is carved well or ill, and how much it cost to gild it. This is all very well. However, there is another class of persons whose interest is also directed to material and personal considerations, but they go much further and carry it to a point where it becomes absolutely futile. Because a great man has opened up to them the treasures of his inmost being, and, by a supreme effort of his faculties, produced works which not only redound to their elevation and enlightenment, but will also benefit their posterity to the 10th and 20th generation. Because he has presented mankind with a matchless gift, these varlets think themselves justified in sitting in judgment upon his personal morality, and trying if they cannot discover here or there some spot in him which will soothe the pain they feel at the sight of so great a mind, compared with the overwhelming feeling of their own nothingness. This is the real source of all those prolix discussions, carried on in countless books and reviews, on the moral aspect of Goethe's life, and whether he ought not to have married one or other of the girls with whom he fell in love in his young days, whether, again, instead of honestly devoting himself to the service of his master, he should not have been a man of the people, a German patriot, worthy of a seat in the Volkskirche, and so on. Such crying ingratitude and malicious detraction prove that these self-constituted judges are as great knaves morally as they are intellectually, which is saying a great deal. A man of talent will strive for money and reputation, but the spring that moves genius to the production of its works is not as easy to name. Wealth is seldom its reward. Nor is it reputation or glory, only a Frenchman could mean that. Glory is such an uncertain thing, and if you look at it closely, of so little value. Besides, it never corresponds to the effort you have made. Responsura tua nunquam est par fama labori. Fame will never be equal to your labor. Nor, again, is it exactly the pleasure it gives you, for this is almost outweighed by the greatness of the effort. It is rather a peculiar kind of instinct, which drives the man of genius to give permanent form to what he sees and feels, without being conscious of any further motive. It works, in the main, by a necessity similar to that which makes a tree bear its fruit, and no external condition is needed but the ground upon which it is to thrive. On a closer examination, it seems as though, in the case of a genius, the will to live, which is the spirit of the human species, were conscious of having, by some rare chance, and for a brief period, attained a greater clearness of vision, and were now trying to secure it, or at least the outcome of it, for the whole species, to which the individual genius in his inmost being belongs, so that the light which he sheds about him may pierce the darkness and dullness of ordinary human consciousness and there produce some good effect. Arising in some such way, this instinct drives the genius to carry his work to completion, without thinking of reward or applause or sympathy, to leave all care for his own personal welfare, to make his life one of industrious solitude, and to strain his faculties to the utmost. He thus comes to think more about posterity than about contemporaries, because, while the latter can only lead him astray, posterity forms the majority of the species, and time will gradually bring the discerning few who can appreciate him. Meanwhile it is with him as with the artist described by Goethe. He has no princely patron to prize his talents, no friend to rejoice with him. Ein Fürst, der die Talente schätzt. Ein Freund, der sich mit mir ergötzt. Die haben leider mir gefällt. A prince who values talents, a friend who delights in me. These, alas, have been lacking in my life. His work is, as it were, a sacred object and the true fruit of his life, and his aim in storing it away for a more discerning posterity will be to make it the property of mankind. An aim like this far surpasses all others, and for it he wears the crown of thorns which is one day to bloom into a wreath of laurel. All his powers are concentrated in the effort to complete and secure his work, just as the insect, in the last stage of its development, uses its whole strength on behalf of a brood it will never live to see. It puts its eggs in some place of safety, where, as it well knows, the young will one day find life and nourishment, and then dies in confidence. The end.